Welcome everyone to the 152nd episode of the Raw Prospect Podcast. My name is Imy Nixon. Today is Wednesday, March 1st, and joining me, as always, from Austin, Texas, the Stat King himself, Mr. Michael. What's up?
Welcome, everybody, to episode 152 of the Raw Prospect Podcast. Technically, some would say it's episode 151, but regardless, guess what day it is? It is March 1st. Does anybody know what that means? We've officially entered March, and in some
March
people's minds,
Madness.
like myself, it means madness.
Yeah.
So we are very excited for March Madness. We're about 10 days away from the bracket coming out. That will be next Sunday. And something we're going to try to do this year that we've been wanting to do past years, but just haven't figured out a time to do it, is a bracket episode where we share one of our brackets, the one we feel comfortable with, because I'm sure you guys fill up multiple, at least two or three. And so we'll try to do that. And the thing that works out well for me, at least, is after next week, going into that weekend of Selection Sunday, it's actually my spring break. So that'll work out well. But yeah, we'll try to do that for you guys. But we're also continuing our team needs series in the NFL, picks 7 through 12, with one exception that we'll explain in a little bit. So with all that being said, be sure to like and subscribe, and let's get started.
Yeah, I'm excited for this. We're going to continue our NFL team needs series that we're doing, going through picks 7 through 12 in the draft, starting with the Las Vegas Raiders. And then once we do that, we'll get into our college basketball stuff. So stay tuned for that. Let's begin this, though. The Raiders. What did you have as their team needs?
Well, first of all, I think a good place to start is who is on the free agent market? Who are their free agents? Josh Jacobs is entering the free agent market, the running back. Clelin Ferrell out of Clemson a couple of years ago, the edge rusher, he'll be a free agent. One of their linebackers, Denzel Perryman, solid veteran role player type linebacker, he'll be a free agent. Two cornerbacks, Averett and Rakia Sin, are both free agents. So there's a good amount of free agents along with wide receiver Mac Hollins. For me, it comes down to building out the offensive and defensive lines and then answering the question of what are you going to do at quarterback now that Derek Carr has been released and is free to go sign with other teams. If it were me, if I were the Raiders, I would probably go the young route, because if you didn't want to keep Derek Carr, it wouldn't necessarily make sense to go after another veteran, because then why didn't you just keep Derek Carr? For me, I think they're going to go the young route, and I would try to go the young route because you'll have more flexibility, presumably, if you go after a rookie quarterback to build out the offensive line and the defensive line, which is where they really need help. I mean, technically, they need help about everywhere on defense, cornerback in particular, and then the defensive lines. So I think, offensive and defensive lines should be the focus. And then we'll see what they do at the quarterback position, but they need to have a guy there. I think it comes down to like as simple as that for Las Vegas.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's all about building that front seven and building up that offensive line. You have to start by building in the trenches. If you're the Raiders, you have skill position talent that's well documented. But great football teams, we saw it this year especially in the NFC. Um, Offensive and defensive line. If that's the strength of your team, it gives you more margin of error in other spots. And that's not to say, you know, the Niners and Eagles weren't stacked, but the offensive and defensive line, that's still the most important part of football. And the Raiders just haven't gotten it right for the last few years. That's simple as that. And then, secondly, it has to be the quarterback position. As you said, I think you got to go young. I think you got to go about this through the draft. Um, I wouldn't advise trading up. I think um, maybe drafting a guy like Anthony Richardson wouldn't be the worst idea in the world. I think you go out and maybe sign a veteran on a cheap deal and then have Anthony Richardson sit and develop. I think that would be a interesting strategy to go about it. But um, there's no real easy way to find a quarterback, as we know. The quarterback position, it's fickle, and a lot of teams get it wrong year over year. We always see that, and no matter what they do, it's going to have to be um, their main focus, or
Yeah,
one of
I
them.
agree with you. But for me, I think it's really important that they go young at quarterback because you have to have. It's nice to have that cap flexibility to build out your roster in other areas that are. I mean, for the Raiders in your division with the AFC West, the Chiefs aren't going anywhere anytime soon. Neither are the Chargers, despite some of the questions that we have with their team and their coach. And then Denver, I mean, you'd expect to be at least better than they were last year with a new coach, Sean Payton, a guy we really like, and some of the guys that were hurt last year coming back. And at least in my mind, it's going to be hard for Russell Wilson to be, unless he's just completely fallen off a cliff, which I don't believe he has, to be as bad as he was last year. I think the Broncos are going to be better next year. So if you're the Raiders, I mean, you're looking at a real tough division that you're probably not going to be able to compete in right now with your situation at quarterback and on the offensive and defensive lines. So you can supplement your roster with free agents for sure. Maybe even re-sign some of the guys that are on the market that you like. But I would mainly focus on building out this roster through the draft.
Yeah,
So
and with that being said, like I think it's probably in their best interest to bottom out a little bit, sacrifice maybe this year to be able to get a high drafted pick or a high quality pick in the following year. But they have some veteran guys on the team that um, really would not like that type of vibe and would probably ask to be traded. So that's an interesting dynamic. And what they do with those veteran guys is yet to be seen. There's no real word on what they'll decide to do with Devontae Adams. They just gave him a big contract, but I'm sure if he were to be available, a lot of teams would be calling. So it's going to be an interesting off season for the Raiders. But that's the thing I'll end on with them is just keep an eye on their veteran players and what they do with
right.
them. Okay, moving on. Um, the next team is the Falcons. I'll start off. My top three needs for the Falcons is edge, corner, and quarterback. Um, I'll start with quarterback because that might be, a little bit more controversial for their team needs. Obviously, um, for the Falcons, you want to continue to try to build your identity. You want to continue to try to acquire weapons for offense and try to build up that defense as well. But I think overall, Desmond Ritter probably did enough to earn a year as the starter. But for me, I think looking at his ceiling, and obviously that's a slippery slope because you don't want to really predetermine a ceiling on a young player because you never really know what may happen. But um, his most likely ceiling, I'd say, is probably around a Kirk Cousins level player. I'd say, um, and if you're the Falcons, I think it would probably be in your best interest to try and look in the draft again. Um, you don't want to be stuck in this purgatory spot that you've been in for quite some time since you won that Super Bowl. And you want to try and get to the next era of Falcons football. And I think part of that is taking a few swings at quarterback, even if that does mean sacrificing, Desmond Ritter a little bit. Um, I think taking the extra swing at it, and even if you do have Desmond Ritter starting, that's fine. You can have the rookie sit. Um, and I think that would probably be a much better situation than just having Desmond Ritter in there. But that's my opinion. Corner, you have three free agents: Oliver, Rashad Fenton, and Ford. Um, and I think you want to supplement that depth there as well. Um, AJ Terrell was, you know, probably a little worse than he was in his sophomore season, but that's not really saying much because he was probably the best corner in football his sophomore season. And this past season, he was probably a top 10 corner. Um, and that's no slight feat. But opposite him, you have Casey Hayward, who is getting older, and also I just question um, what type of versatility you have with a older corner opposite your star corner. Like teams are just going to attack that player, so you need to supplement that with um, the right talent, young talent in that spot. I think that will be extremely important. And then edge, they drafted Arnold Ebiketie last season, who I really like and was good for them. But you've got to keep looking in the draft because it's been 3 years now of them being in the bottom five in sacks, I believe. And at some point, you want to get that bona fide guy. Um, and I'm not saying, a number two rusher. I think you got to go out and try to get your main guy. And I'm saying like in a Nick Bosa type of role, the star main pass rushers is kind of the mold I'm thinking of.
We agree once again. Look, if you're the Falcons, you won 7 games last year. You're in a division that, aside from Carolina's young defense and some solid young players on that roster, that we personally, or at least I personally, have a lot of hope for going into next year if they can find someone decent at the quarterback position. I mean, outside of that, there's a lot of uncertainty in this division. You have the Buccaneers, who we don't know the direction they're heading in yet, but they could end up going just full out rebuild. And then you have the Saints, who are also in sort of a position of we don't know what direction they're particularly heading in at this moment in time. You have $55 million in cap space if you're the Falcons, at the very least, and you could do some restructuring of contracts to possibly have even more than that. So for me, you've been squishy in the run game defensively, and your pass rush hasn't been very good. So it's that defensive front four in particular, on the interior and on the edge, like you spoke to, that you have to get better. That would be my number one priority, is focusing on getting different skill sets on that front four, on the interior and on the edge, that will help you not only in top end type talent, but also in depth. Some of the guys you drafted last year, I like. The production on the field wasn't, top notch, but you can't really expect that from rookies drafted in the second and third round right away. Um, if it were me, if I were the Falcons, you have $55 million in cap space. I look around the league. I know Javon Hargrave from the Eagles is a free agent. You have the money. Maybe go look at him. He's a guy that would really help on the interior defensive line. And then go out and spend some money on an edge rusher or try to trade for someone solid. Maybe even go through the draft to do that. But I would definitely get some proven talent on the defensive line. Corner, we'll see what happens there, but they definitely need help at corner, as you said, 3 cornerback free agents. So, and that's the position you definitely want to have depth. And right now, I mean, you really don't have much. So we'll see what happens there. There are some potential targets in free agency, but if it were me, I mean, it depends on where you want to spend your money. But you can take a look at the free agent market or go through the draft. But where they are, I think, is probably a little too high to be drafting a corner in the first round, particularly in this class. And then quarterback, I would go young. Ritter is a guy that I like, but as you said, you don't want to be stuck with just having Desmond Ritter. If you can get a guy, like a Will Levis potentially, maybe trade up, or even an Anthony Richardson could be really interesting in this offense. And one more thing I'd add, you have Kyle Pitts, you have some interesting pieces in the passing game, but I would try to re-sign Olamide Zaccheaus, a wide receiver out of Virginia that's been very good and productive for them as well. Probably get him on a somewhat team-friendly deal, and he's been really productive for them. So, I mean, if you're the Falcons, it's sort of this position where you just maybe a couple moves away, you never know, with a decent quarterback from being like an 8-9 win team in that division. I mean, it's not out of the question.
Yeah, and you could argue Arthur Smith is the best coach in that division as well.
Right.
Um, the one thing I'll end on is I think the Falcons just need star players. They have a lot of, average and a lot of, solid players, and they're a team that doesn't really beat themselves, but at the same time, when they play against the high level talent, they struggle because the high level talent is just going to win out. Um, and I'll close with this. I think with the offensive line they have and the running game that Arthur Smith has built, I think Bijan Robinson would be really interesting in Atlanta. But that's another discussion for another day. I'll end on that though. We're going to move on here to the Carolina Panthers, the aforementioned other team in that division that we find interesting. This team, it's all about quarterback. But I'll let you start off since I started off with the last team.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are potential. I mean, we're not really talking about the draft yet,
Mhm.
but I think they're a potential candidate. I mean, you talk about teams like the Colts, the Raiders, to potentially trade up to get a quarterback. Um, I also think that this would be a very interesting place for a guy like Anthony Richardson to end up. But that's a story for another day. Quarterback is the problem. Uh, since they haven't made the playoffs since 2017, and that drought really coincides with a quarterback drought. They've had a drought at that position, 2 injury-plagued seasons from Cam Newton, and then a quarterback carousel where they haven't found their guy yet. Now, I will remind everybody, they do have Matt Corral, but he is coming off an injury. So I think you go out, whether you trade up or I highly doubt that Frank Reich wants to go the veteran route again, given the lack of success he's had going that way. So you go out and you draft a guy, and you have a competition between, I believe Darnold's still there, right? So
Mhm.
you have a competition between Darnold, the guy that you draft, whether that's Will Levis or Anthony Richardson. Maybe if you can get up as high as like CJ Stroud, but we'll see. And you have a competition between those three guys. And then the offensive line was better last year. I still think you could use a piece or two on that offensive line. Keep building out your depth. I love the defense. There's a lot of young talent there. It's pretty fantastic. And they're going to keep getting better. And then, I think you could probably add, Matthew Ioannidis is a free agent. Their center, Bradley Bozeman, is a free agent. One of the linebackers, Corey Littleton, he's on the market. I think you could add a piece. I know you have Brian Burns, but maybe a piece opposite Brian Burns or a piece on that interior defensive line. Just keep building out the trenches. I love the secondary with Chin and the guy out of South Carolina. What's
JC
J.C.
Horn.
Horn?
Mm.
They've had solid linebackers in the past. I don't worry too much about that. And the defense is really young, which is good. So I love, the weapons that they have, the weapons they've added the past couple of years. You could probably use another receiver, but you can get that, in the third or fourth round. But you got to address quarterback first, and then probably still go after offensive line. And then I'd say either an edge or another defensive tackle would be my top needs for the Panthers.
Yeah, we're on the same wavelength here, but the only other need I would have said was wide receiver slash tight end. I think with whatever quarterback you decide to bring in, or even if you don't decide to bring a quarterback in, if you decide to roll with Sam Darnold for some reason, you want to bring in those weapons and continue to build that depth. I like DJ Moore. I like Laviska Shenault in that kind of gadget role. Um, and then Terrace Marshall, a guy who was on that 2019 LSU team, is kind of a question mark because he's struggled with injuries. But even so, I still think you could benefit from bringing in another guy. Um, I look at maybe the tight end position as maybe being one where, could really help a young quarterback that you bring in. Or even if it's, a guy like Jordan Addison, and if he somehow, drops to your pick in the second round, possibly, that would be a home run, in my opinion. I think you need some, you know, not necessarily speed. You have speed. I just think you need dynamic playmakers on the
Yeah.
outside. And then defensive tackle, you have Derek Brown, and you have a whole lot of, depth pieces there. I think you could benefit from putting another guy next to Derek Brown on that interior, like you said. Um, so yeah, it's pretty simple for the Panthers. I think they're in a pretty good spot, um, given where the rest of the division is. But it's all about just getting a decent baseline of quarterback play wherever you decide to go. You just have to have that um, average to good quarterback play on a uh, decent level of consistency, and then you'll be able to win games.
Right. And one thing I'll remind everybody of is that typically their owner, David Tepper, has been very aggressive.
Yep.
So I'm not saying it's for sure going to happen, but they're definitely a team to keep an eye on to potentially trade up in the first round to go get a quarterback if they really want to go get a quarterback, which I think they should. Because really, for them, I see it as you're a couple supplementary pieces on your offensive and defensive line. plus maybe another receiver and a solid quarterback away from winning this division and getting yourself into the playoffs, especially with a coach like Frank Reich, who is a very solid coach.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's really it for the Panthers. They're really an exciting team that we'll be talking about all off season long. Um, they might be like sort of like they might end up being like the Titans or the Buccaneers of years past, where we got really excited about them, but hopefully they actually pan out this time. But anywho, we move on to the 10th pick. The Philadelphia Eagles, who were just in the Super Bowl. And they own the Saints pick, so that's how they got here. Pretty nice. Just got off a Super Bowl appearance, and you have a top 10 pick. I'll start with you. They're your division rival. They do have a lot of impending free agents. What are their top needs, in your opinion?
Um, to me, I think their offense is pretty solidified. I think if you're going to go offense, I think maybe you look at possibly a third or fourth wide receiver just to add some depth. But that's really just nitpicking. I think the focus should be um, on some of the key defensive positions where you're going to have free agents there and also future free agents. So to me, those positions would be cornerback, safety, and linebacker. I'll start with cornerback. I think you have Darius Slay and James Bradbury, who's a free agent, and you have Alante Maddox, who was a really good third corner as well. But I think with Darius Slay getting older, and also I think he'll be a free agent after this next year as well. I think you kind of want to get ahead of a possible future need that will be there um, next year, and then obviously I think um, you want to bring James Bradbury back as well, but that's kind of why I have cornerback here. It's whether you decide to bring James Bradbury back or not. Either way, I think you'd benefit from drafting a corner or finding a corner in free agency elsewhere as well. Um, Safety, you have Rodrigo Blankenship and C.J. Gardner Johnson, who are both players I really like. Especially, I'm just gonna say CGJ. I guess that's a hard name to say. Well, not really, but I'm just lazy today. Um, he's a player I really like. I like his versatility, being able to slot in at corner when the need is there. Um, I think he's definitely a priority to bring back. But if you're not able to, I think that's a place where you can kind of, like I said, get ahead of it and look elsewhere to try to fill that need as well. Like maybe even go younger because CJ Gardner Johnson, he's with football being how it is, with it being the not for long league, as people say, he's on the older side. He's not necessarily old, but being 27, 28 years old, that's kind of on the older side for a defensive back in the NFL. Okay, and then thirdly, I said linebacker. You drafted Nakobe Dean um, in the third round, I believe it was last year. He didn't really get much playing time because you had the other two guys, Edwards and White, ahead of him. Both of those players I really like, but they're also both free agents. So that's another position where um, you maybe bring one of the two back, and then you look to supplement that with cheaper options elsewhere, possibly. Because a lot of these guys on the defensive side of the ball that are free agents are looking to get paid. Um, like a guy you mentioned earlier as well, Javon Hargrave. So it's all up and down this defensive roster. You have free agents that you want to try to supplement those positions with depth just in case you're not able to bring some of these guys back.
Yeah, and if this was almost any other team, it would be. But the Eagles' organizational philosophy, past 5-ish years, you know that the trenches are going to be a focus in the draft. I mean, that's just how it's been, and you give them credit because they've set themselves up in a better position to potentially lose one or two of these up front because they've been drafting at that position and they have the necessary depth. And that's what we talked about basically the last half of the regular season going into their playoffs and that Super Bowl run is how good that pass rush is, but the reasons why it was so good. It's because nobody ever got tired because they have the depth. I mean, they could just go to another guy and keep bodies fresh. And that pass rush was deadly. So, I mean, you look at their free agents, you're probably going to lose Hargrave, but you drafted Jordan Davis and you have some other guys there. Um, Brandon Graham's a free agent, but he's age 35, but he's still fairly effective. We'll see what they do there. And then also, Robert Quinn and Ndamukong Suh are also free agents. So you're probably going to lose one or two of those guys. So I would keep on, they'll probably bring back two of those guys. So you could use to draft another defensive line or edge rusher or two, maybe. Definitely cornerback is probably my number one priority with what you're potentially going to lose in the secondary. CJ Gardner Johnson at safety, along with Marcus Epps, is also a free agent. And then James Bradbury at the corner position. I think corner and safety are probably the top two needs. Darius Slay, he's aging a little bit, but he's still very productive. You definitely want to have a guy opposite him, though. So if you lose James Bradbury, it was very solid for you. You could go after the free agent market. The Eagles have been a very aggressive team in terms of making moves as well, trading for veterans. Or, right around 10 is probably the spot where you maybe could start thinking about drafting one of the corners in the draft. But we will see. Safety and cornerback are probably the two main focuses. And then I just refocus on supplementing your depth up front. Even I'm not saying it's like an urgent need, but you could definitely, I mean, you can always use to do that. And I think the Eagles will, based on what we've seen the past 3 to 4 years and their organizational philosophy is building in the trenches. Something else you have to consider, though, is what does Jason Kelsey do? What does Lane Johnson do? I suppose you'll probably know by the draft. So maybe making a move or two late in the later rounds on the offensive line would possibly be a smart move as well.
Yeah. Um, the one thing I'll say to counter your point on the defensive line side of things, I think the fact that you drafted Jordan Davis really helps things as well. If you lose Javon Hargrave, which you most likely will, and then Brandon Graham, he kind of feels like a lifelong Eagle to me. I don't really see him leaving. I see him maybe giving them maybe a team friendly deal, a hometown discount per se, because all that he's done in that organization, the long career he's had there, I see him retiring as an Eagle, whether that be next year or in the future. I see him staying with the Eagles. Um, and then the fact that you have Hassan Reddick locked in as well. I think Hassan Reddick is the guy that, um, from the Eagles' perspective, they see as their main guy going into the future as their edge piece, their alpha edge rusher per se. I think that's the guy you look at and you kind of feel more confident about maybe losing some of your other edge rushers as well. But I do agree with you. There's never a bad time to supplement depth on the front seven or on the offensive line. But I feel a little bit better about where they're at on the defensive line than maybe some other people do. But let's move on. Our next team is the Tennessee Titans. They have the ninth
11th pick.
pick in the draft. Yeah, the ninth pick in the draft this year. Um, it was a rough year for the Tennessee Titans last year. It had some bright spots, of course, but I think overall they didn't really meet expectations. They had to move around a lot of pieces going into last year because of their cap struggles. And going into this year, I think you kind of look to maybe reset, um, maybe get younger as well. Um, some of the things I look at is probably um, probably wide receiver. That's the biggest one. It's hard to say really where you go with that because you have Robert Woods who just recently got released, and then Traylon Burks who you drafted in the first round last year. He looked good in in spots, but you really do need that depth at receiver. That's the number one thing. And then O line, you just cut Taylor Lewan. I'm not sure what the reason behind that was, but nevertheless, I think you got to draft a tackle. Um, and really, all along that offensive line, you could look to upgrade, in my opinion. I don't think there's really any particular spot on the offensive line where, that guy is, a lock to stay a Tennessee Titan. I don't think that's the case at all. I think you could upgrade at any of those spots. Um, and that's where the Titans have gotten worse in the past couple of years. It's on that offensive line. When the Titans were at their best in those Derrick Henry years where they're really running the football, that offensive line was always really, really good. And they need to get back to that. And that also fits, with the identity of their coach and the culture they like to have. They like to play hard nosed football. That's what Mike Vrabel preaches. Oh my gosh, I can't talk today. Lastly, I think you need to address the cornerback position. You drafted Christian Fulton a couple years ago in the first round. He looked okay last year. I think given the injury history he had going into the draft, I think if you told Titans fans he would play in most of his second season, I think they would be pretty happy. But even with that, I think you need a number one corner. And based on what we've seen so far, it could change. Based on what we've seen so far, I don't think Christian Fulton will be that guy. So addressing corner is definitely going to be a priority.
I largely agree with you. Um, Offensive line is the most important. I mean, you look at their situation right now. I think they had some questions about Luan's health. His apparently his second ACL repair in their eyes didn't really go as well as his recovery didn't go as well as they thought it would, and they had some questions with his health. And he's a guy who's been very solid. So he might not have been willing to come back at the type of deal they potentially wanted to do with a guy of his, you know, aging a little bit, but still very good. I know the Steelers potentially have some interest in him as their left tackle. We'll see where that goes. But potentially, I mean, Ben Jones, potentially, there are retirement rumors. Uh, we'll see what their interest is in re-signing the right guard, Nate Davis. I mean, there's a potential if things don't go as planned that they could need not just a left tackle, but a couple new pieces on that offensive line. I think that's the number one need. And then you got to look at receiver. In today's day and age, you have to have weapons. Robert Woods, as you mentioned, was just released. You have two tight ends who are free agents as well. I'd probably say wide receiver / tight end. Austin Hooper is an unrestricted free agent. Maybe you resign him, but if you don't, that's a need. Just weapons in general. And then, I mean, pick your poison from there, but definitely supplementing your depth, in the secondary would would be smart. I won't go too long with the Titans though, because we need to move on. We're already 40 minutes into the episode.
Right. Okay. Last team here. It's going to be the Cleveland Browns. They have the number 7. Well, I think they
So
traded their pick. Yeah, they traded it to the Texans. So this is not actually their pick, but we slotted them in place of the Texans because we already covered the Texans last episode. So if you're interested in what we have to say about the Texans, go listen to that. But for now, we're going to cover the Browns, and I'll let you start off.
okay, the Browns. So you have Deshaun Watson locked in, I believe, to potentially make $55 million next year. He's got a $46 million cap hit plus like a $9 million bonus of some sort. So I was looking at their needs the other day. So yes, they will not be drafting in the 12th spot. So just keep that in mind. I'm not even sure they have a first round pick. I don't think they
No,
do.
they don't.
So I mean, let's look at their free agents. If you guys like this stuff, Spot Track is a really good website where you can look at this salary caps, free agents, all that kind of stuff. So if we go to the Cleveland Browns, I know you're going to probably lose Davion Clowney. You're losing, it looks like, Taven Bryan, some guys up front that are potentially free agents. Chris Hubbard, one of your tackles. I mean, with the Browns, it just seems like they just need to supplement their depth up front, as we say with any other team, especially the defensive line and edge. Rasheem Green, Obo Okoronkwo. Forgive me if I mispronounced that. They're both free agents. OJ Howard's a free agent, but we'll see what they do there. I would supplement your depth along the defensive line, potentially get another offensive lineman or two. And then what is their situation at receiver looking like? You have, of course, well, you are losing Jacoby Brissett. It looks like you might lose Kareem Hunt. I think you're pretty set at receiver. Ethan Posich, your center, is a free agent. So I think the offensive line is definitely a need, along with some pieces on the defensive line. And then, outside of that, I think the Browns have a pretty solid roster. It all depends on the performance of Deshaun Watson. Now that you have the dark cloud, at least you've gone through a season, you have the dark cloud sort of, you've put that to the side. You saw what you have. I'm going to be honest, I'm not too familiar on the Brown situation, but from what I can see, you could probably use a couple pieces on both sides of the ball up front, especially in a division like the AFC North, where, I mean, Cincinnati's got a good pass rush. The Steelers have a great pass rush. The Ravens always are pretty solid up front. It's smash mouth football in this division. So I think that's important. But you can probably tell me more about the Browns.
Well, I'm right there with you. They got to address the defensive line and linebacker positions. It's all about building up the front seven for the Browns. I think with the situation being what it is and how much money you're paying Deshaun Watson, this draft is going to be possibly the most important draft the Browns have had since getting back into the NFL. So if they don't like get quality pieces, contributors on, the not just the front seven, but throughout their whole team, whether it be, undrafted free agents just late in the draft, you got to hit on most of these picks or else you're going to be in a really rough spot. And it has to start with the interior defensive line. I mean, um, right now it's Taven Bryan, who's a free agent. Um, he's the only somewhat quality player in this group. Like everyone else on that interior defensive line, they really struggled. I mean, Tommy Togiai, undersized guy they had drafted a few years ago, he hasn't developed into what they thought he would be. And even if he does take a step forward next year, he's not a run stopper. He's more of a pass rush specialist from the interior, and that's not really what they need. They need um, a Linval Joseph type, a Fletcher Cox type, a guy who's going to just take on double teams and stonewall an opposing team's running game. Because last year they were just so squishy up the middle. So those were the three positions for me. It was interior D line, edge, linebacker, and then I just put an asterisk just to say this draft is going to be so essential.
Absolutely. Um, so those are 7 through 12. Probably on the next episode, we'll 13 through like 18 or 19 or something like that. But we do have other stuff that we need to get to in other sports. So it might be a couple episodes from now that we resume this. But I really do like this segment. So for the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to talk about college basketball before we wrap this thing up. What I wanted to do today was just get a general feel for where we're at with 1 week to go until conference tournaments begin for the main power conferences. About a week and a half until bracket is revealed. Where do we stand on some of these teams? So what I did is I made a tiers list, sort of like we're going to be doing for the NBA here pretty soon, on where I think things stand based off what I've seen and what I know. So I would like to get a feel for where you're at right now, just in terms of who's the cream of the crop in college basketball right now. Who are the teams that you envision right now easily like being a Final Four contender, being potentially on Monday night in the national championship game? And then who are the teams below that and where do they stand? So just give me your general feel for that right now.
Um, well, I really like Houston and what they are able to do offensively with pushing the pace, and defensively they just, I mean, they're all over teams. I mean, they just hound you like constantly. They force a lot of turnovers. They get out in transition. I mean, that's their calling card, and they're fantastic at it. They rarely have a game where they're not forcing over, 10 turnovers, which is pretty wild, honestly. Um, and the thing with Houston that I really like is just they know their identity and they know what they like to do as a basketball team. Um, they're gonna push the pace. They're gonna control the pace of the game, ideally, and they're gonna defend. And you know, up to this point, they've had like a few hiccups here and there. Well, a couple of losses, but they weren't bad losses. I think one of them was to Virginia, if I'm not mistaken. Virginia in uh, Virginia, I think. Um, but Houston to me is probably in my A tier in terms of teams that I could see in the Final Four. And then going further down, um, it gets a little tougher because I see Alabama as kind of a flawed team. Um, they're they're amazing defensively, and they have you know superior athleticism to most of their competition. But I think in a one game scenario, I just question how consistent their shooting will be. Um, They rely on it a lot. They take a lot of threes, and the saying in basketball is you live by the three, you die by the three. And I think in a Sweet 16 scenario, if their three ball goes cold, by some by some chance their three ball goes cold in one of those Sweet 16 games, I think they could be in trouble. So that's kind of where I see Alabama. They're a I think they're a key threat that you have to consider, absolutely, with the way they defend. But um, that's the main question I have with them. And then in terms of a tier list, I would kind of have Houston at the top, and then kind of a minus tier with Kansas, um, and some other teams as well.
I think this year we have a pretty wide open. Like I think the playing field has evened out a little bit. Now, here's what I will say. I think there are 3 teams in particular that right now I would favor, just in terms of my eye tests and what the metrics say, what the resume says, that I think are set up really well to be a Final Four player / maybe even a national championship contender. Houston, you mentioned them. They are currently the betting favorite to win it all, and for good reason. They're 27-2. The Final Four is in Houston, so if they did get there, that'd be pretty crazy. Over the past 5 years, there's not been a national champion that didn't rank both top 22 in offensive efficiency and defensive efficiency. Over the past 5 years, you have to be in the top 22 of those teams in both offensive and defensive efficiency if you want to be a national championship team. And Houston ranks in the top 10 in both of those. They're elite defensively. They're physical. They wear you out throughout the course of a game. Marcus Sasser, Jamal Shedd, and Jarris Walker, they're sort of like Baylor in a sense, where while those aren't all guards, they have 3 guys. They have a monster, 3-headed monster that can get buckets and play defense at an elite high level. They have the shot creation, and I think the one thing that we've seen is they've proven it already. They already went to a Final Four a couple years back. So with Kelvin Sampson, as you mentioned, I think you really hit it right on the head. They have an identity, and they don't waver on that identity. So they're set up really well. They have the coach, they have the scoring, they have the shot creation, they have the depth. They have everything going for them. Kansas. Texas has lost to TCU. They have won the Big 12 regular season title outright. Texas had to win both their games this week against TCU and Kansas to clinch a share of the Big 12 title with Kansas. But they lost a close game to TCU on the road tonight, the first time they have lost back-to-back games all year. I'll talk about Texas in a little bit. But Kansas, what a job by Bill Self. I think he has to be considered as right now the best, like the class of coaches in college basketball. He's potentially the best. You have the championship pedigree. You have Jalen Wilson. You have a point guard who's playing really well right now in DeJuan Harris, one of the more underrated point guards in the entire country, who's really good defensively. Had 6 steals on Saturday against West Virginia. Really good on defense. KJ Adams Jr., their power forward / stretch 3, really good defensively. He's an energizer bunny. He's really good. And you have other pieces. Grady Dick can shoot the lights out. They have all the components of a national championship team. And then UCLA is the one that, for some people, comes out of nowhere. Some would say they don't play in a particularly hard conference, and I would agree. I don't think the Pac-12 is all that great, with the exception of UCLA and Arizona. But again, they have an elite coach. Mick Cronin is fantastic, and they play defense. They buy in on the defensive end of the floor. And they're sort of like Alabama in a sense, where they do need to shoot a decent percentage to keep themselves in games. But they have that veteran presence in their backcourt. They have shooting in their backcourt with Tiger Campbell and Jaime Jaquez Jr. And they have a solid big guy who you can run the pick and roll game with. So I think those would be my three. And then Alabama is wavering on right on the edge. They're carrying some baggage right now off the court. And I think in some ways you could say it's probably affected their team's play. They're still winning games, and that's all that matters this time of year. But they struggled to beat Auburn. They've struggled the past couple games. But they're athletic. Brandon Miller, most of the time, will be the best player on the entire court if he is still playing going into the tournament, which at this point, I think he will be. So I think even though I disagree with how they've handled that situation, and we don't need to get into that, they're still, in terms of a basketball team, right up there with the best of them. They've been pretty much the best team in the SEC start to finish. And the SEC is a good conference. I don't think it's as good as the Big 12, for sure not the Big 12. I don't think it's as good as the Big East even. But, it's probably a top 3, top 4 conference in all the country. So that's my championship bubble. I have Kansas, Houston, of course, right at the top. Then just a notch below that, I have UCLA. We've seen them do it before. Mick Cronin is fantastic. They have the experience. They buy in defensively. And then right below that, I have Alabama. Just because it can be hard when you're dealing with a situation like they are off the court. But I don't doubt that they have the talent necessary to get there. It will just be about whether or not, how this legal situation plays itself out. And then do they shoot the ball well enough? But they have the depth and athleticism to match up with pretty much anybody. If we go beyond that, I'll mention my next tier of teams. So that's my championship tier. My next tier teams are definitely probably, as long as things don't go drastically wrong, they don't have an injury in a conference tournament, they don't, get ousted by a hot mid-major team in the first round in an upset. These are teams that definitely have the roster makeup, the identity needed, and the talent needed to at least get to the second weekend of the tournament. Sweet 16, Elite 8. There's questions, though, that are holding me back from putting them in that next tier with the actual championship contenders. Those teams are as follows. Purdue, they were in that tier a couple weeks ago, but they've fallen off a little bit. Zach Edey, we don't doubt that. He's going to give you what he gives you. But outside of that is where I have some questions. They're talented at the guard position, but they have 2 freshmen in their starting lineup. And that can hurt you when you're going up against some of these more experienced teams that have the guards that have been there and done that. It's very rare that we see teams with young freshman guards win national championships. I'm just saying. So that's my question with them. Baylor, I still put them in this tier. And at this point, I might put them a little above Texas in the Big 12. But right now, they're tied for second. So, and they both won a game head-to-head over one another. As long as Keontae George's ankle is healthy, that three-headed monster with Flagler and Cryer and Keontae George with Tama Chachua on the inside. I mean, with Scott Drew as your head coach, that's tough to beat. So at Baylor, K-State, Jerome Tang right now would be my pick for Coach of the Year. They're, I believe, 23-8, something along those lines right now. Been playing really good basketball. And Marquise Noel, he's a microwave at point guard. He can score, create his own shot. And then Keontae Johnson, he's the transfer from Florida who's coming back from the cardiac arrest, similar to DeMar Hamlin in the NFL. I mean, those are bucket getters right there. Those are gamers. Outside of that, there are some questions, but they could be tough out. I think they could get to a Sweet 16 for sure. I have Texas in this tier, but I'm not panicking by any means. I mean, losing on the road to Baylor is certainly no disappointment. And then losing on the road to TCU, who is finally healthy once again, by 2 points in a game in which you shot less than 40% from the field, being in that game where TCU shot north of 50% from the field, it shows their resiliency, which they've had all season. And this is the first time, at the beginning of March where you've lost 2 consecutive games. I think this could be good for Texas going into the tournament. Going into the conference tournament now, I think you're going to have to beat Kansas at home on Saturday if you want to still have a chance at a number 2 seed. But right now it's going to be hard for them to fall anywhere below a number 3 seed. And they're a top 10 experienced team in the country. They're resilient. The only place I worry about them is, and I've said this before, size on the interior and getting on the boards has been a killer for this team. It's been a common theme in their losses, getting out-rebounded and out-physicaled on the boards, and not allowing those second chance points is going to be key. But Marcus Carr, Tyrese Hunter, who has been good lately, and then Serge Jabari Rice off the bench, who a lot of analysts agree is the best 6-man in college basketball right now. I mean, they definitely have the talent and the experience to get there. I do worry about their rebounding, their physicalness on the interior, and Rodney Terry. I mean, just going up against some of these more experienced coaches in the later rounds of the tournament as a guy who, stepped in midseason and has done a fantastic job, but that can be tough. So I think for Texas, as long as you get to a Sweet 16, it's a success of a season. And I think that's fair to expect. And then Marquette, the last team I'll mention, nobody is talking about Marquette, at least among the general college basketball fans right now. But, man, are they dangerous. Shaka Smart is kicking ass once again like he was pre-Texas at VCU when he made that Final Four run. This is a Marquette team that, get this, was picked 9th in the preseason coaches poll in the Big East. That's second to last in the Big East. They were picked to finish 9th, and they just won the Big East title outright in the regular season. That also goes to show like preseason polls are meaningless pretty much. But, I mean, still, this was a team that wasn't returning a whole lot this year. And, man, have they surprised. Tyler Kolek is one of the better point guards in the entire country. They can shoot it, and they buy in defensively. Shaka Smart is back to implementing that full court pressure defense that he implemented at VCU, not so much at Texas. They are definitely a threat to at least get to the second weekend. I mean, winning the Big East Conference is no short feat. I know Villanova sort of had a down year, but there are other good teams in that conference. Providence, Xavier, the list goes on and on. So I think Marquette is a team that, in your bracket, just don't don't gloss over them because they are for real, in my opinion. Do you have any thoughts
Definitely,
on that?
definitely. Um, I would just say, in terms of Kansas State, um, they're a team I really like just because of, as you said, they have a couple of dudes that are tough shot makers, and um, in the tournament, you never know what may happen, but you're likely going to get into a close game situation where um, you're going to have to hit tough shots. You're going to have to take and make tough shots, and K State can do that, and that's a clear outright advantage that they'll have on most of their opponents. So whenever you look at it that way, I think K State is I think I would agree with you that they're in tier 2 or 3, but they're a threat. They're definitely a threat.
Absolutely. So to wrap this up, uh, my next tier, uh, since I am sort of a college basketball nerd, this is the tier that, excuse my language, I'm calling the oh fuck, we have to play that team in the second round tier. These are teams that I have my fair share of questions about that I think could, the way they're playing right now, could definitely get to a Sweet 16. But I think they have limited ceilings for different reasons. But right now, with the way that they're playing, going into conference tournaments, the momentum that they're picking up, and with some of the players that they have, if you're like a 2 seed and you got to play like Duke in the second round as a 7 seed, I mean, that's sort of like a oh shit situation.
Yeah.
Um, so the teams in this tier are Gonzaga. Can't forget about Gonzaga. Indiana, who finished second in the Big Ten behind Purdue, but I actually swept Purdue in the regular season, so that's sort of interesting how that works out. Um, Duke, as I just mentioned, Creighton is a dangerous team, in Miami out of the ACC. I'll kind of group them together. I mean, Gonzaga, it's Mark Few. I feel like the past 2 to 3 years, we've been talking about Gonzaga as a prime candidate to get to the Final Four, maybe even a national championship. This year, they've had their fair share of struggles, but Drew Timmy's still fantastic. Will probably be maybe first team, but definitely second team All-American. Julian Strother is a guard that I really like. The necessary length and athleticism on the defensive end and the shot making ability that will probably translate to a potential to the next level. I think he's a interesting NBA prospect for whenever he decides to enter the NBA draft. Not necessarily as a first round guy, but probably as like an early second round dude. He's an interesting guy. But it's Mark Few. This offense is really efficient. They're just not quite as great defensively this year as they have been in years past. That's where I worry a little bit. But they can score like they've always been able to. So we'll see where that goes. They're not as loaded as they have been in years past, but it's still Gonzaga. Um, Indiana, they swept Purdue in the regular season. They have arguably the guy who will be the runner-up in National Player of the Year conversation to Zach Edey and Trace Jackson Davis, who's a top 5 player in college basketball. They'll be a first-team All-American. Question with Indiana is, what do they get from their young guards? Jalen Hood-Schifino is a really interesting guy who, if you haven't watched yet, I encourage you to maybe catch an Indiana game in the Big Ten tournament. But he's a guy that's really athletic, can score the basketball, but has been inconsistent, as most freshman guards are, especially playing in a conference like that. So it's just whether or not they shoot the ball well and get good production out of those guards. But Trace Jackson Davis is an absolute nightmare. So be on the lookout for Indiana. They were playing really well Like they were one of the hottest teams in the country up until they just lost to somebody. I can't remember who it was. It might have been Iowa. I forget. But they just lost to somebody. But they're still playing really good basketball. Duke. This is where it gets interesting. 22-8 in John Shire's first season as head coach post Coach K. With the way that they started, that's pretty good. Now, I have some questions. They did go 16-0 at home in Cameron Indoor, which is one of the better home court advantages in college basketball. We know that. They played really well at home. But I still want to see them win a couple games in the ACC tournament on that neutral court. And I also want to see them this weekend going on the road to North Carolina. That'll be the primetime game. Duke, Carolina always is. Carolina's a team that really hasn't lived up to any sort of expectations, but they're still sort of on life support trying to make the NCAA tournament. And regardless of how good the team is, that's always a tough environment, especially hosting Duke with that sort of rivalry. I want to see Duke play well on the road. I want to see them play well on neutral courts because that's the environment you have to be able to succeed in the NCAA tournament. And they're young. And it's not often we see young teams, particularly blow it out of the water when it comes to the NCAA tournament. But John Shire has done a fantastic job. Miami's a team. They've got two really experienced guards. They almost made it to the Final Four last year. They were in the Elite Eight. Jim Larinaga is a solid coach. So I think they're dangerous. And then Creighton as well is sort of in that same bucket. So those are teams that will probably be like on the 4, 5, 6 lines, maybe 7 lines when it comes to seeding in the tournament. But if you're a higher seed, if you're a 1, 2, or 3 seed, you got to play those teams in like the second or third round, Sweet 16. I mean, it's no walk in the park. So those are sort of my oh shit moment teams that you don't necessarily want to face right now, considering how good they're playing. But I do have questions about how high their ceiling is. So
Yeah.
that's all I have to say.
Yeah, I got the chance to watch Gonzaga the other night against St. Mary's, their, main competitor in their conference. And the interesting thing to me is they still had their, moments of, scoring brilliance. They still are potent offensively. And as you said, they do have those defensive struggles, but some of the things that they were struggling with defensively, it felt like more so a lack of attention to detail rather than a lack of talent. So if things click here in the next week and a half or so, they definitely could be a dangerous team. Absolutely. The thing that I would kind of point to and say maybe they won't be able to fix it in time is probably their rim protection. They give up a lot of points in the paint, and they really struggled with that against St. Mary's. So if they're able to address a couple things here and there, I definitely do see them as a dangerous team. And then Indiana, whenever you have a top 5 player in the country, you're at the very least interesting. I think with Trace Jackson Davis, I think that poses a matchup problem for, a large majority of teams that you'll face in the tournament. So as long as he's playing at the level he's capable of, they have a chance against any team in the country, really. And then what was the other team? Duke. I haven't watched much of Duke. I'm not gonna lie, but 16-0 at home. That's nothing to scoff at. That's really really impressive. It'll be interesting to see how they play against North Carolina. I think that'll be a big game in terms of how people will perceive them going into, making brackets and all that type of stuff. So if they're able to perform well in Chapel Hill, I think that'll be very telling as to where this team is actually at.
Yeah, I mean, it's getting interesting, folks. We are nearing that time where it's about to get crazy. So I think. Do you have any comments on Texas before we wrap it up?
Um,
Or not
I
really?
think I think they just got to keep plugging away at it, man. I don't think much has changed from when they were winning games. Outside of just there's not really like a late game execution problem like we've seen in years past. So, you lost a couple games. It's just like, you lost to a couple of quality teams. I don't think it's anything to feel terribly about.
No, I'm certainly not panicking. I'd love to see them beat Kansas this weekend just because sometimes the difference between a 2 seed and a 3 seed can be, I mean, it's nothing to scoff at, like say it's meaningless or anything. But I'd probably say at this point, with the success of a team like Baylor, the successes of teams like UCLA, Purdue, who I don't foresee falling off the 2 line or the 1 line. Of course, Alabama, Houston, UCLA. Texas is probably in for one of the top 3 seeds in the tournament, which is fine. But yeah, I mean, the main concern for me is rebounding. But that's something I think that is part fundamentally like an issue, but also just sort of a roster construction issue. But you can fix it if you just bring the intensity and the will to rebound on a nightly basis and that physicality. So it is what it is with Texas. We'll see what happens. But that's going to wrap it up for this episode. We ended up in a pretty good place, hour 17 minutes. Um, make sure to like and subscribe. We'll be planning our next couple episodes. Probably have one this weekend, sometime next week as well. F1 starts this weekend, so I'll be
Yep.
watching that. The first race of the season, so that will be interesting. We'll probably have another Patreon episode in the next couple of weeks talking about F1 and maybe some other things as well. And aside from that, I mean, NBA is going on, and then we're approaching March Madness, and we'll continue with our NFL offseason stuff. And then sooner rather than later, we'll get into some baseball as well. But if you don't have anything else to say, um, do you? No
No,
closing remarks?
all good.
I guess just like Marcus Mariota's career in
Atlanta.
Atlanta, we are going, gone.
Peace out.